Morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us. We'll begin with chapter 5, verse 2. We read this pasuk yesterday that after all the counting and numbers, flags from last week's parsha, God says, okay, send out all these ritually impure people from the camp. So besides anything else, let's just see a little bit what's going on in general with this. Rashi, second Rashi on pasuk Beis, Vishalchu min hamachaneh. Shalosh machanos hayusham b'shas chaniyasam. The Jewish people were encamped. There were three different sort of layers of camps. Toch hakloyim himachne shechina. In the middle of everything was the area of the Mishkan, and that was what was called as the camp of the divine presence. Chanias halvim saviv, k'moshe beforish parshat Bamidbar Sinai yimachne levia. Surrounding the Mishkan was the encampment of the Levium. Remember, the Levium didn't have sort of a special spot in conjunction with the other 12 tribes. They were just camped around the Mishkan. That's called the Levium camp. And beyond the Levium were the rest of the 12 tribes on four sides. And so there were different, there was a configuration of how the tribes were camped. That's called Machne Israel, the camp of Israel. So there was the camp of the Shechina, which was the Mishkan, the camp of the Levium, which was the Levium around the Mishkan, and the camp of Klal Yisrael, which was everybody else. Hatzarua nishtaleach chutz lekulan. A person who has tsaras, this thing that we translate as ritual leprosy, is sent out of all of the camps. That's really in isolation. Hazav mutar b'machne Israel. The person who has certain fluids coming from him is considered ritually impure. He is allowed to be among the broader group of Klal Yisrael. He's just not allowed to be in the Mishkan, nor is he allowed to be among the camp of the Levium. So in other words, if a Levi would have this type of impurity until he had purified himself, he would have to leave his home and live among the lowly other 12 tribes. And a person who had come in contact with the dead body, they were ritually impure, but the only thing they weren't allowed to do is they weren't allowed to go into the Mishkan area. But in other words, if a Levi, went to do a tahara for somebody, that was okay, and the Levi could continue to live among the Levi camp. The only thing is, the Levi would not be able to go and serve in the Mishkan until he had appropriately purified himself. So that just gives a little bit of context for what we even mean when we're talking about expelling the ritually impure people from the camp. Three different types of levels. Now, what I'd like to discuss is, why is this here? So these first psukim are talking about people who are impure, who are sent out of the camp. Then the next pasuk, starting with verse 5, is talking about a very subtle, very technical issue having to do with a person who steals from another person and swore that they hadn't stolen and then confessed that they had sworn falsely. So there's a penalty. And then there's discussion, what if the victim of the theft has passed away and he has no surviving heirs? Who should the thief pay it to? This is extremely technical. What's this all about here, and why is it here? So if you look at the Ramban on pasuk Beis, after God, after the Jewish people had established the Mishkan, now God's instruction is that ritually impure people should be expelled from the camp. Because we want the camp to be holy, fitting for the divine presence. This was the goal of all of this. The goal of the Mishkan was that the divine presence should reside among the Jewish people. So what does that mean? That if you have all these ritually impure people in all these different spots in the camp, so you wouldn't accomplish the desired goal if you don't have standards in terms of people who are ritually impure. Okay. Uba'avur shemana Yisrael mishpachosam v'beis avosam v'hivdil mehem erev rav asher b'socham hishlim ba'asham hagzelos din hagozel es hager. So this is really interesting. So the Ramban says there's another fallout from the discussion of the counting and the flags, which is, what about the Erev Rav? Right? The Erev Rav, the mixed multitude who had come from Egypt to join with the Jews. So they're not in any of these tribes. They're not members of any of these tribes. So the implication, of course, is that they kind of live beyond, in between, but they don't have a special place that's theirs. Sort of as a consolation to that, at this point, God conveys the halacha that there's a specific halacha for a person from whom an item is stolen, and then the person passes away and there's no heir. Who's the classic individual who would pass away without heirs? The convert. Because for these halachos, the convert is not considered related to his or her biological relatives, right? In other words, until they hopefully are able to build their own family and start their own Jewish family tree. So there's sort of a consolation here that there's a very specific consideration in the Torah for what happens in such a circumstance. The Erev Rav shouldn't feel that they don't count. It's very unfortunate they don't have a set place to live like everyone else, but there's still a consideration of the Erev Rav. Just thought that was an interesting Ramban. Okay, going on now to verse 6. Dabero b'nei Yisrael, speak to the Jewish people. Ish o isha ki yasu mikol chatos ha'adam, a man or woman who does one of the sins that human beings perform, limol ma'al b'Hashem, to steal against God, v'ashma nefesh, and that soul is guilty. Okay, so if I only read this pasuk to you and I asked you, what are we talking about? I don't know what any of you would assume. I would assume that a person broke into the Mishkan and stole something. That's sure what it sounds like. And me'ila is the classic term for a person who takes something that's sacred and uses it for personal benefit. So that's what the pasuk sounds like. But then in verse 7, at the end of verse 7, it says, and then they should give it to the person to whom they were guilty. So that's not stealing from God. And then verse 8 talks about it. If the person who was the victim of the theft doesn't have an heir, we're clearly talking about stealing from a person. So what's this language, limo mal b'Hashem, to wrong God? And again, as I mentioned before, me'ila normally means to steal from sacred things. So there's an interesting sforno over here, sforno on pasuk vav. Limo mal b'Hashem, kfar bir HaKabbalah, shezen nemar gazel hageres. We already referenced the context of these psukim is a person who steals from a convert. Ki amnam hagozel oso, person who steals from a convert, Mechalel Shem Elokav Beinei Agir. What a desecration of God's name. That here you have this convert, Asher Balachsos Tachas Knafav, that this person cast so many things aside for the sake of coming under God's holy wings. And because the person wants to be one of God's nation, one of God's chosen nation. And then this member of God's chosen nation steals from a person who gave up so much to be part of God's people. That's a chilul Hashem. What's a greater chilul Hashem than that? V'lochein yikarei moel b'kodesh, says the Sforno. That's why the language used here is for someone who steals from God. Because no, technically you didn't steal from God. Technically you stole from this person. But to steal from that person, what greater disgrace of God and his people could you think of? So this Sforno says that's the pshat in the language. Okay. And the korban that the person brings is a korban asham. The korban asham is normally associated with people who steal from the Mishkan or Beis HaMikdash itself. So that's an interesting idea from this Sforno. Okay, let's go on now to verse 12. Okay, verse 12. I just want to say that last time we discussed this topic, I told myself I'm not going to discuss this with you people at least for a year, but we're back. And that is the topic of Sota. Sota is a complicated topic. I certainly don't pretend to understand it all, but we'll do our best. Verse 12. Daber b'nei Yisrael v'martu aleihem. Speak to the Jewish people and say to them, Ish ki sisteh ishto, a man whose wife turns away from him, acts in an unfaithful manner, moal avo moal, and the wife wrongs. It's very interesting. The same language of Me'ilah is here too that we just talked about in verse 6. The wife wrongs the husband in a way, in a language that's associated with taking from God himself. Verse 13, V'shochavi shosashich lazera v'ne'elam meinei isha v'nistra b'mitma v'eid ein ba v'hi lo nisbasa. And another man sleeps with her. So she's married to her husband, and then she's unfaithful. She sleeps with another man. Now, what it seems to be from the following psukim is really, it's more that her husband suspects her of sleeping with someone else. But what is clear is she was in seclusion with another person, which is, in other words, she's, as we say, she's not acting like an innocent person. But we don't know. We don't know if she sinned or not, and the husband has suspicions. And this is where the Sota halacha comes in, and a person comes, and the husband and wife come, and there's a whole procedure done in the Mishkan or the Beis Hamikdash. Okay, but what I'd like to discuss for a moment here is this language of moal mal, that she wrongs her husband, and again, the language is this language of taking from God. Says the Sforno, it's the second Sforno on Pasuk Yud Beis. Chilala es kodesh Hashem asher ohev b'kedushe ha'ishus. So this is another kind of desecration of God, not stealing from the convert, which was one type of desecration from God. But God has this holy thing, the sacred relationship between husband and wife. B'chivuk v'nishok zulas isha v'domeya. That she acted, the wife in this case acted in a manner of whether or not she had marital intercourse with another man. She, presumably physically expressed affection in other ways with this man. And that, even if she didn't do the sin of sexual intercourse, is taking from God's holy treasure, which he imparts to humanity, which is a special relationship between husband and wife. I thought it was an interesting thing to think about. So we discussed this morning the idea of the impure person being exiled from the camp. We discussed why that's placed here. We discussed two sfornos having to do with two very different halachos, both using the language of stealing from God.